My wife showed up with her lover at home and said, without hesitation, as if it were a calculated and cruel sentence, "He will be my new husband." The air condensed the moment the words left his mouth, turning the warmth of our home into a biting cold that invaded my chest like a blade. My first instinct was to react, to scream, to destroy, but my mind, still processing the absurdity of the scene before me, forced me to pause. I looked at her, eyes fixed, waiting for some hint of regret, even a hesitation, but all I found was the arrogance of someone who believes they have won. And him? The man next to her, with a confident posture and an almost mocking smile, only seemed to confirm what I already knew: they had been planning everything for a long time. She continued speaking, as if she were giving a well-rehearsed speech. "You already knew this was coming. It's better this way. You were never able to give me what I really needed. He understands me, he values me. We're going to start a new life, and you're going to have to accept it." Each word was like a dry blow, but the biggest impact was in her eyes, cold, calculating, as if the woman I once loved had disappeared, replaced by a stranger who seemed to take pleasure in destroying me. I swallowed hard, without responding, feeling the weight of each word. An uncomfortable silence fell over us, and all I could hear was the sound of the clock on the wall, each tick a cruel reminder of the time that seemed to have stopped. But inside me, something was moving. It wasn't sadness. It wasn't anger. It was something deeper, a cold, calculating determination that grew with every second. I knew I couldn't let this betrayal go without consequences. I took a deep breath, forcing a smile, and with a calm that seemed almost artificial, I asked, "So, do you plan on starting this new life together? Here, in my house? With the things I've achieved?" She hesitated for a brief moment, but then responded firmly. "We deserve this. You'll get used to it. It'll be better for everyone." They underestimated my reaction. They believed that I would accept this humiliation like a defeated man. But while she talked, while he looked around like he already owned the place, I planned. I absorbed every detail, every word, every expression. They thought they had everything under control, but they were wrong. Terribly wrong. In the days that followed, I acted with the coolness of a strategist. I watched, listened and waited. I discovered more than I wanted to about her lover, his connections, his weaknesses, his ambitions. He wasn't just any man, he had a history of manipulation, of deceiving people to gain an advantage. He was exactly the type of person who would take advantage of someone vulnerable. But my wife, she wasn't vulnerable. She was an accomplice. I let them believe they were winning. That I was the submissive and resigned man they imagined. And while they laughed behind my back, while he started to feel too comfortable in my house, like it was already his, I was putting together all the pieces I needed to turn the game around. One night, while they were talking in the living room, amidst laughter and whispers that disgusted me, she called out to me, as if she were trying to establish some kind of perverse normality. "You should join us. After all, we're all still under the same roof." I looked at them, with that same fake smile that I had practiced so many times in the last few days, and replied, calmly, "Ah, you're going to love the surprises I have prepared." They laughed, thinking it was just a minor tease. But that moment sealed their fate. I knew their time was running out. Everything was ready. The next steps would be perfect, cold and calculated. The first phase of my plan had already been completed, ensuring that he, the trusting lover, was exposed for the opportunist he truly was. What they didn't know was that he had a dirty history, one that involved more than betrayal. And I had proof. Meanwhile, I continued to play my role, watching their every move, listening to their every word. My wife seemed increasingly confident, thinking that her perfect life was about to begin. But there was one detail she had never anticipated. I wasn't the kind of man who just accepted defeat. They were about to discover what it means to underestimate someone who has nothing left to lose. And the most ironic? They themselves, with their arrogance and carelessness, had given me the tools to destroy them. Still, in the midst of all this, one question kept echoing in my mind, keeping me awake on nights when hate wasn't enough to fill the void. How could someone who once promised to love turn into something so distant and cold? That question, however, will have to wait. There are more important things to be resolved first. And when everything is revealed, when all the masks fall, perhaps the answer will be as impactful as the betrayal that led me here. Welcome to the channel where intense stories come to life. Here, we never support any type of betrayal. Our stories are fictional, created to show how betrayal can destroy lives, relationships and trust. Get ready to dive into a powerful and emotional narrative that will stir your emotions. Grab your attention and hold on tight, because what comes next is simply shocking. Good story. It was an ordinary morning when Ethan walked down the stairs of his impeccably organized home, the smell of fresh coffee filling the air as the first rays of sunlight streamed through the large living room windows. He adjusted the cuffs of his shirt with the precision of someone stuck in a meticulous routine. Ethan was the type of man who built everything with effort: his comfortable home, his solid career at a technology company and, most importantly, his marriage to Clara. In the eyes of any outsider, they were the perfect portrait of a couple who overcame the challenges of time. They had been together for more than a decade, and their lives seemed intertwined by a love that, at least on the surface, had never wavered. Clara entered the kitchen, her hair still damp from her morning shower. She was graceful in a way that seemed natural, as if elegance was part of her essence. Always smiling and attentive, Clara was the central figure who united everything around her. She took care of the small details that made the house feel like a home, like arranging the flowers on the living room table or keeping the books perfectly aligned on the bookshelf. As Ethan poured 2 cups of coffee, he watched her with a look that mixed gratitude and a kind of tiredness he would never admit to feeling. He knew that the foundation of everything they had built depended on a fragile balance, a delicate game of concessions and compromises. Their home was a refuge. Located in a quiet neighborhood, with trees lining the streets and friendly neighbors, it felt like a scene straight out of a postcard. The walls were decorated with photos of the trips they had taken together, memories of moments that now seemed to belong to a lighter era in their lives. There was one specific photo that always caught Ethan's attention, one in which Clara laughed spontaneously, with her eyes closed, as the wind ruffled her hair on an idyllic beach. He adored her in that way, simple and genuine, but something inside him said that that smile seemed increasingly rare. Over the years, responsibilities accumulated, and the time they used to dedicate to each other had become diluted into a relentless routine. Clara, who was previously a literature teacher, now dedicated her time to sporadic work as a proofreader, while taking care of the house and small projects that kept her busy. Ethan, on the other hand, immersed himself more and more in his work. The endless meetings, tight deadlines and increasingly demanding goals kept him away from everything he had once considered important. What began as a healthy ambition had turned into a comfortable but lonely prison. On that particular morning, as Clara served toast and fruit for breakfast, she felt a pang of melancholy that she couldn't explain. It was as if something was out of place, but he didn't know what. Ethan noticed her unusual silence and tried to break it with a simple question about her plans for the day. Clara smiled, but it was a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Something was changing, but neither of them could put a name to it. The nights had also changed. Before, they were full of relaxed conversations and easy laughter, but now they were dominated by a comfortable, or perhaps, uncomfortable, silence. Clara read alone in the room while Ethan reviewed reports in the makeshift office. The sound of turning pages and the occasional sound of the keyboard filled the house, but didn't drain it of life. The weight of years of living together was beginning to create invisible cracks, and they were too busy to notice. Ethan, however, missed something he couldn't explain. A kind of connection, a spark that reminded him of why it all happened. He loved Clara, but sometimes he found himself wondering if she still felt the same way about him. He tried to bring back small gestures, flowers on an ordinary day, invitations to dinner out, notes left on the table, but these efforts seemed to dissipate into the everyday. Clara always thanked him with a smile, but there was an invisible barrier between them that neither of them dared to recognize. Clara, on the other hand, also had her own doubts. At some point, the woman full of dreams and plans had lost herself in the routine of being Ethan's wife. It wasn't that she didn't love him, but sometimes she felt like the world around her was moving, while she remained stuck in the same place. When he hugged her, she felt comfort, but not the same passion as before. When he said he loved her, the words seemed to lose their strength in the monotony of the days they shared. She didn't know how, but she felt like something inside her was changing, and that change scared her. The discussions, which were rare, always revolved around trivial things: who forgot to lock the door, who didn't wash the dishes, or who should take care of the garden. They were never intense, but they left a bitter aftertaste that took a while to pass. Both avoided major confrontations, as if they were afraid of what they might find if they dug too deep. Friends, when they came to visit, always praised the couple. "You are perfect together," they said. The example of a successful marriage. Ethan and Clara just smiled and thanked them, without correcting their assumptions. There was no room for confessions in a world where everyone believed they had everything figured out. That week, Ethan began to notice small details that had previously gone unnoticed. Clara seemed distracted, as if her mind was always somewhere else. He tried not to think about it too much, chalking it up to the pressure of everyday life. But inside, he knew something was different. She seemed more reserved, more careful with her words, as if she was afraid to say something she shouldn't. And that made him uneasy. Clara, in turn, noticed that Ethan was more distant, but at the same time more observant. There was a care in his gestures, but also an underlying tension that she couldn't decipher. It was as if they were playing a silent game of chess, each move meticulously calculated, with neither of them knowing exactly what the end goal was. The house, once a place of safety and comfort, began to transform into a stage of contained emotions, unspoken secrets, and an anxiety that hung in the air like a storm about to form. Both felt the change, but neither had the courage to name it. The apparent harmony hid something deeper, something that was about to emerge, and neither of them was prepared to deal with the consequences. As the routine continued, with silent breakfasts and lonely nights, time seemed to conspire against them. And, although none knew it yet, the days of apparent calm were numbered. Ethan began to realize that the silence between him and Clara was no longer a peaceful refuge, but a slowly growing emptiness, a distance that, although invisible, was almost palpable. For days, he tried to ignore the feeling that something was wrong, focusing on work and the small gestures that he believed would be enough to reconnect the two. However, there was something in Clara's eyes, a restlessness that she couldn't hide, even in the simplest moments. He felt like he was missing something he didn't even know how to define, and it gnawed at him more than he was willing to admit. That morning, as they drank coffee in a silence too comfortable to be real, Ethan ventured a question. "You seem distracted lately. Is everything okay?" Clara looked up from her cup, smiling with a lightness that seemed rehearsed. "Yes, of course. I've just been thinking about a few things. Nothing important." The answer should have reassured him, but the lack of details did the opposite. She avoided talking about her days as often as before, as if everyday stories had lost their importance. Ethan wanted to believe it was just a phase, but something deeper made him hesitate to accept that explanation. As the days passed, he began to notice patterns. Clara went out more often, always with vague excuses about commitments with friends or small projects that she had taken up. When he asked for more details, she responded naturally, but something about her posture seemed calculated, as if every word was carefully chosen so as not to arouse suspicion. He tried to push those thoughts away, telling himself he was being paranoid, that his insecurity was the real enemy. But at night, as she prepared for bed, he couldn't help but watch her movements, looking for some sign that could confirm or dispel his doubts. One night, while Clara was in the shower, her cell phone vibrated on the living room table. Ethan, who was finishing reviewing a report, instinctively looked at the device. It was a message, but the lock screen only showed the name of the person who sent it, a male name he didn't recognize. He felt guilty for considering picking up the phone, but the discomfort remained. Clara had always been reserved with her personal space, and Ethan respected that, but now her curiosity seemed greater than her ethics. However, he did not touch the device, choosing to keep his concern to himself. In the following days, Clara's departures became more frequent. She groomed herself more carefully, something Ethan noticed but chose not to comment on. He wanted to believe this was part of an effort to feel better about herself, perhaps an attempt to rediscover the lightness she seemed to have lost. But inconsistent schedules and evasive responses began to take their toll. One afternoon, realizing that she had forgotten her purse at home, he noticed a receipt from a restaurant they didn't go to together. It was dated to a day when Clara was supposedly at a meeting with friends. Ethan didn't confront Clara right away, but the doubt was now a constant shadow. One night, after another one of Clara's outings, Ethan decided to talk to a close friend, someone he trusted deeply. He needed to hear another perspective, someone who could help him see if he was just falling victim to his own imagination. During the conversation, he reported his observations cautiously, not wanting to sound accusatory. The friend listened attentively, but in the end, he said something that made Ethan even more uneasy. Maybe it's just a phase, but if you feel like something isn't right, maybe it's time to talk to her directly. Ethan didn't know how to start this conversation. He wanted to believe that Clara was still the same woman he loved, but the growing distance between them was undeniable. He wondered how many times he had ignored the signs, believing that time would solve everything. But time, instead, seemed to be building an invisible wall between them. He decided to wait for the right moment, but the wait made him increasingly anxious. It was on a seemingly ordinary night that Ethan finally saw what he didn't want to. He had returned home earlier than usual after canceling a meeting at the last minute. Clara wasn't home, which he expected, but her car was parked in the driveway. Confused, he entered, calling her name, but got no response. It was then that he noticed something, a man's coat thrown on the living room sofa, an item that certainly wasn't his. Ethan's heart raced, and he climbed the stairs slowly, the sound of his own footsteps resonating in his mind like a warning. When he opened the bedroom door, the scene before him made time stop. Clara was there, with another man, in an intimate gesture that left no room for doubt. Her gaze, noticing Ethan's presence, mixed surprise and something that seemed to be a failed attempt to justify the unjustifiable. The man next to her just stared at him, without saying a word, as if he was assessing the situation, waiting for the next move. Ethan didn't scream, he didn't explode. He stood still, staring at the two, feeling a mixture of emotions that seemed too much to process. Anger, sadness, betrayal, but most of all, an overwhelming feeling of emptiness. He took a deep breath, closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them, something had changed in his expression. Without saying anything, he turned and went down the stairs, leaving behind a stunned Clara and a silence that seemed louder than any words he could say. From that moment on, Ethan knew his life would never be the same. As he walked out the front door, he didn't know exactly what he would do, but one thing was certain, that betrayal would be just the beginning of something much bigger, and he was determined not to be the one to bear the consequences. Ethan didn't come home that night. He drove aimlessly through the empty streets, trying to organize the whirlwind of thoughts and feelings that consumed him. The cold of the night didn't seem to affect him, the betrayal had left his mind numb and his heart heavy. He thought about every detail of the last few weeks, trying to understand where he had failed, what he could have done differently. But no matter how much he searched for answers, an insistent truth stared him in the face: Clara had chosen to cheat, and nothing he could have done would change that. He parked the car in front of a small bar he never frequented. He went in, sat down in the most discreet corner and ordered a drink. As the liquid burned his throat, a mixture of anger and determination began to take hold of him. It wasn't just the betrayal that bothered him, but the way Clara had acted, as if everything was normal, as if he wasn't important. And that man. Ethan didn't know who he was, but he swore to himself he would find out. The next morning, Ethan returned home. Clara was sitting in the kitchen, with an expression that mixed guilt and defense. She tried to speak, but he interrupted her, his voice firm but restrained. "Don't say anything yet. I need to understand everything before I hear your excuses." She hesitated, but nodded, as if she knew any word would make the situation worse. He went upstairs, grabbed some clothes and left again, without saying where he was going. Over the next few days, Ethan used all his energy and skills to investigate. He knew that Clara wouldn't confess everything right away, so he needed proof, something that would force her to face the truth. He discovered the man's name, Lucas, and, with that, began to put together the pieces of a puzzle that turned out to be much bigger than he could have imagined. Ethan discovered that Lucas wasn't just a lover, he had a problematic history, involving manipulation and taking advantage of vulnerable people. He was exactly the type of man who infiltrated other people's lives to take advantage. But the real revelation came when Ethan found something that left him perplexed. Clara and Lucas had a plan. It wasn't just an affair, but a conspiracy to keep him away from his own home, from his hard-built life. Ethan, with the information he had gathered, decided to confront them. He arranged to meet Clara in a cafe, a public place where she couldn't just run away or deny it. When she arrived, there was a mixture of surprise and nervousness in her expression. He started straight away, without beating around the bush. "I know about Lucas, and I know about what you guys are planning." The words hit Clara like a blow, but she tried to maintain her composure. "Ethan, I can explain." He interrupted her again, his voice thick with frustration. "Can you? Because so far all you've done is trick me. So go ahead. Explain." Clara began to speak, but her words were hesitant, disjointed. She tried to justify her actions, saying she was confused, that she felt neglected. Ethan listened, but his patience was at its limit. "Do you think that justifies plotting against me? It's not just about you betraying me, Clara. It's about you and Lucas trying to destroy everything we've built together. And worst of all, you thought I would never find out." Clara, now visibly shaken, tried to deny involvement in any greater plan, but Ethan was not fooled. He placed the documents and messages he had found on the table, indisputable evidence that Lucas had influenced Clara so that she left him and, together, they took possession of the house and other assets. Clara remained silent, unable to deny what was before her. "You knew exactly who he was, didn't you?" Ethan continued, his voice lower but full of intensity. "You knew he was using you, and you still chose to go through with it. Why? What did he offer you that was more important than everything we experienced together?" Clara started to cry, but Ethan didn't feel sorry. For the first time, he saw clearly the person she had become, and the sight was devastating. Lucas unexpectedly appeared at the cafe. Maybe Clara had warned him, maybe it was a coincidence, but her presence only heightened the tension. He approached the table with a smile that irritated Ethan to no end. "So we're all finally here. I guess that makes things easier." Ethan stood up, remaining calm despite the fury burning inside him. "It makes it easier, yes. Because now I don't need to play this game anymore. I already won." Lucas tried to intimidate him, but Ethan was prepared. He put more evidence on the table, revealing not only their plan, but also Lucas' dirty past, including debts and accusations that he had managed to avoid until now. Clara turned pale as she realized she had been manipulated, used as a pawn in a bigger game. Lucas, in turn, tried to play it down, but his confidence began to waver. "You underestimated the wrong person," Ethan said, his voice firm and full of determination. "You both thought you could destroy me, but now you're about to face the consequences of your choices." Lucas tried to react, but the evidence was overwhelming. Clara, in tears, begged for forgiveness, but Ethan knew there was no more room for that. The tension in the air was almost unbearable. Ethan felt a mixture of relief and sadness when he saw everything that had been exposed. Clara and Lucas were now facing not only the consequences of their actions, but also the void left by their choices. Ethan, although hurt, knew this was the time to move on, to leave behind a chapter that, although painful, would not define who he was or who he could become. Ethan walked out of the cafe with firm steps, but the weight of the moment still pressed on him. The image of Clara crying, confused between regret and shame, mixed with Lucas's expression, who for the first time seemed to recognize that he had lost control of the situation. But for Ethan, this was just the beginning. He knew that revelations needed to be followed by concrete actions. It was not enough to unmask them, he needed to ensure they both faced the consequences of their choices, both emotionally and legally. He went to the office of his lawyer, an experienced and meticulous man, who had already been informed about the situation. Upon entering, Ethan was greeted with a firm wave and a direct question. "Do you have everything you need?" Ethan placed the documents, messages and evidence on the table. "I have more than enough. I want everything to be done cleanly and quickly. I don't want to leave any gaps for them to escape." The lawyer leafed through the papers, his keen eyes examining every detail. "This is going to be a hard blow for them, especially this Lucas guy. But are you prepared for what comes next? Because, believe me, reactions can be even more unpredictable than their actions." Ethan knew the lawyer was right. He needed to be emotionally prepared for what was to come. Clara was not just his wife, she had been his partner, his confidant, the person with whom he had shared the most meaningful moments of his life. Facing the fact that all that had been destroyed required strength that he still didn't know if he possessed. But as the lawyer continued to review the documents, he remembered something that kept him going: he couldn't let her mistake define his life from now on. That same night, Ethan returned home to get the rest of his things. Clara was there, sitting on the sofa, as if she was waiting for him. Her gaze was empty, marked by a mixture of tiredness and sadness. When he entered, she slowly stood up, but didn't try to get closer. "I didn't know he was like that, Ethan. I thought he was different." Ethan paused for a moment, her words echoing in his mind. He could feel the weight of the confession, but his trust had been broken to such an extent that those words no longer had any impact. "Clara, you may not have known who he was, but you knew who I was. And that should have been enough." His voice was controlled, but filled with a pain he couldn't hide. "I'm not here to argue or listen to justifications. I'm here to finish what I started. Tomorrow you'll receive the divorce papers, and after that, everything between us will just be part of the past." Clara tried to speak again, but Ethan interrupted her with a gesture. "You made your decisions, Clara. Now, I'm making mine. Don't try to reverse this, because what was destroyed here is beyond repair." He went up the stairs, picked up the bags he had prepared earlier, and went down without looking back. Clara stood still, silent tears streaming down her face as he walked through the door and disappeared into the night. In the following days, tension intensified. Lucas attempted to contact Ethan, but his efforts were immediately blocked by his lawyer. He knew his only way out was to face legal consequences, but his arrogance prevented him from accepting defeat. Clara, on the other hand, seemed to have fallen into a state of apathy. She didn't discuss the terms of the divorce, she didn't make demands. He just followed the process, as if he was accepting that this was the only way to deal with what he had caused. It was on a sunny morning that everything came to a head. Ethan was in his lawyer's office, signing the final documents that would formalize the divorce and ensure that Lucas would not have access to any of the assets he had tried to manipulate. While signing the final paper, a message arrived on the lawyer's cell phone. He read it quickly, frowning before looking at Ethan. "You won't believe this," he said, turning the computer monitor to show a news story that had just been published. Lucas had been arrested that morning for involvement in a fraud scheme that was unrelated to the case with Clara. He had been caught red-handed, and the charges were serious enough to warrant that he would face a long sentence. Ethan didn't know what to feel at that moment. Part of him felt immediate relief knowing that Lucas was finally out of the picture. But another part realized that, even with that outcome, the scar left by Clara's betrayal would not disappear so easily. He knew there was still a long way to go to rebuild his life and find a new purpose. Determined to move forward, Ethan began investing time in himself, reconnecting with friends and exploring interests he had put aside over the years. He began taking photography classes, something he had always been intrigued by but never had time to explore. In one of these classes, he met Sophie, a vibrant and energetic woman who seemed to see the world through a unique lens. Not only did Sophie awaken something in Ethan that he believed was lost, but she also brought a lightness he hadn't felt in a long time. As the months passed, Sophie's presence in his life brought more than comfort, brought hope. Ethan learned that the pain of betrayal didn't need to define who he was or what he could achieve. He found in Sophie a new kind of connection, one that was not just based on trust, but also on mutual respect and a genuine desire to share authentic moments. While Clara dealt with the consequences of her choices, isolated and filled with regret, Ethan felt like he had finally found something she could never take away from him, his ability to start over. He knew there would still be difficult days, memories that would come back to haunt him. But he also knew he had the strength to continue. And, most importantly, that he deserved to be happy. The house seemed emptier than ever. Clara had left the home that had once symbolized their union, taking with her only the few belongings that remained after the division. Ethan, now alone, walked through the rooms in silence, feeling the echo of what was previously filled with laughter and conversations. It wasn't just her physical absence that filled the space, but the void left by the shattering of everything he believed to be solid. He didn't know if the silence was comforting or suffocating. Some nights, it felt like a release. Others, a cruel memory. Lucas, on the other hand, faced his consequences abruptly. The arrest brought to light not only his fraudulent schemes, but also a public exposure of his actions. News circulated quickly, painting him as the manipulative man he was. Clara was also not immune to this public trial. Although she was not directly involved in the illegal activities, her association with Lucas became a source of scorn and condemnation. Ethan knew this, but surprisingly, he felt no satisfaction. There was no pleasure in watching them face the weight of their choices. There was just a tiredness, an emotional exhaustion that seemed to have no end. With the divorce finalized and Lucas out of the picture, Ethan tried to get his life back on track. However, he soon realized that moving forward was much more complicated than he imagined. The trust that had once been the basis of all their interactions now seemed like a difficult barrier to overcome. When meeting friends, he often found himself analyzing every word, every gesture, as if looking for signs of disloyalty. He knew this was irrational, but it was something he couldn't control. The betrayal had planted a seed of doubt in his mind that seemed to grow every day. One day, while going through old boxes in the attic, he found a photo album of his honeymoon with Clara. Each image told a story, a moment of genuine happiness that now seemed to belong to another life. He hesitated for a long time before deciding what to do with it. Throwing it away felt like an act of denial, but keeping it also seemed to carry an unnecessary weight. In the end, he chose to donate everything, as if getting rid of those objects would help him leave the painful memories behind. Ethan continued attending his photography classes, trying to fill his time with something that brought him a sense of purpose. Sophie became a constant presence in his life, but he avoided delving too deeply into that connection. Not because he wasn't attracted to her or didn't enjoy her company, but because he feared taking the ghosts of his past with him. Sophie, however, was patient. She didn't push, just offered silent support, a presence that slowly began to break down the walls Ethan had built around himself. Meanwhile, Clara faced her own journey of self-reflection. Isolated, she began to understand the extent of the damage she had caused, not just to Ethan, but to herself. Her choices had led her to a place of loneliness, an abyss of her own making. She tried to renew old contacts, but found that many of her friends now avoided her. The betrayal and association with Lucas had irreparably tarnished his reputation. She spent days staring out the window of her small apartment, wondering at what point her life had gone off track. One afternoon, Clara gathered the courage to write a letter to Ethan. It was not a request for reconciliation, but an attempt to express what she had been unable to say before. She explained her feelings of inadequacy, the insecurities that led her to seek something outside of marriage. She admitted that she had been selfish, that she had ignored the signs of how much Ethan was trying to save them while she was wallowing in her own doubts. She ended the letter by apologizing, not in the hope of being forgiven, but as an act of releasing the weight she was carrying. When Ethan received the letter, he read it carefully, each word charged with emotion. He didn't know what he expected to feel, but what he found was a mixture of sadness and understanding. Although the pain was still there, he realized the letter was not for him. It was for Clara. It was her way of finding some peace amidst the chaos she had created. He put the letter in a drawer and decided he wouldn't respond. Some things, he thought, were better left in the past. Over time, Ethan began to realize that his life was changing in ways he had not anticipated. He found himself more attentive to the little things, the sunlight streaming through the window, the sound of rain on the roof, the laughter of strangers in a cafe. He began to value moments that previously went unnoticed, as if he was relearning how to live. Sophie remained by his side, and he finally began to allow her to come closer, not as a replacement for Clara, but as someone who could share a new chapter of his life. Clara, on the other hand, found a different kind of redemption. She began volunteering with an organization that helped women overcome difficult situations, an endeavor that gave her a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. Although she knew she could never erase what she had done, she committed to using her experiences as a lesson, a way to prevent others from making the same mistakes. Ethan and Clara did not meet again after the divorce. Their lives followed different paths, but both carried the marks of what had happened. For Ethan, the challenge was not just overcoming the betrayal, but rediscovering who he was outside of that relationship. For Clara, it was learning to live with the consequences of her choices and finding a way to move forward without being consumed by guilt. As the days turned into months, Ethan's life began to take on new shapes. He realized that although the pain was still there, it no longer defined who he was. He began to see his past not as a burden, but as a lesson that had shaped him. And as he walked along a trail in a local park one quiet morning, he looked out at the horizon and felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Time passed, and each one followed paths they never imagined they would follow. Ethan, now far from the shadows of what happened, found himself at a point of balance that seemed unreachable months ago. The relationship with Sophie blossomed naturally, without the pressure of expectations or ghosts from the past. He realized that by accepting the betrayal as a chapter in his life and not the entire book, he was able to free himself. There was no more room for bitterness, only for the present he was learning to value. However, life does not follow a linear path, and destiny sometimes holds surprises that reopen wounds only to show how much they have healed. One afternoon, while walking through a local market with Sophie, Ethan spotted Clara. She looked different, with her shoulders a little more hunched and a look that held years of regret. She saw him too, and for a moment, time seemed to stop. Sophie noticed the exchange of looks and, without saying a word, lightly squeezed Ethan's hand, indicating that she would support him if he wanted to get closer. Ethan hesitated, but eventually walked over to Clara. The meeting was brief, marked by a silence that said more than any words. Clara opened her mouth to speak, but Ethan interrupted her with a gentle gesture. "It's okay. We both move on." Clara waved, her eyes teary but without tears. That moment was not for arguments or excuses, but for closure that they both needed. As Ethan walked away, he realized he didn't feel anger, just deep compassion. Clara, as much pain as she had caused, was also a victim of her own choices, a prisoner of regrets that might never leave her. Sophie, in her quiet wisdom, didn't ask about the meeting. She knew that some things didn't need to be explained, just understood. Lucas, on the other hand, faced a harsher fate. After his arrest, the truths about his schemes continued to emerge, revealing a pattern of behavior that made it clear he was never looking for real connections, just opportunities to explore. The years he spent behind bars were a cruel reflection of his choices. He tried to contact Clara, but she, finally understanding how much she had been used, refused any approach. Lucas lost everything: his freedom, his influence, and, perhaps most painfully, the illusion that he could always manipulate the world to his advantage. Clara, although free to rebuild her life, faced daily challenges. The volunteer work she did brought her a purpose that she had previously lacked, but also a constant confrontation with the reality of what she had lost. She helped other women overcome trauma and rebuild their lives, but every story she heard was a reminder of her own failures. Still, she continued, not out of redemption, but because she found a small peace in knowing that she could do some good, even amid the rubble of her own choices. Ethan and Sophie, together, began to build a future that was both simple and extraordinary. They did not seek perfection, but truth. Ethan learned to trust again, and Sophie showed that despite the scars, he was still capable of love. One peaceful night, while watching the stars in a remote field, Ethan finally found the words he had long hesitated to say. "Thank you for being patient with me. I thought I would never be able to trust anyone again, but you showed me that it's still worth believing." Sophie smiled, squeezing his hand. "I didn't do anything, Ethan. You're the one who decided to allow yourself to live again." The story of Ethan, Clara and Lucas had no winners in the traditional sense. They all carried their own lessons, their own pain, and faced the consequences in different ways. Ethan chose to move on and found a new chance at happiness. Clara, even trapped in her regrets, found a purpose that gave her the strength to continue. Lucas, although defeated, was forced to face who he truly was, an inevitable reflection of his own actions. Now that the story has come to an end, leave your thoughts in the comments. We want to know your opinion about the dilemmas and twists in this plot. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to follow more impactful stories like this. Remember, here, we never support any type of betrayal, but we believe in exploring its consequences to show the profound impact these choices can have on the lives of everyone involved. Until next time, and thanks for watching.